Thanks for joining us. Subscribe to Cheating Stories so you don't miss any new tales. Have you noticed changes in your unfaithful wife's behavior? Has she stopped trusting you? Maybe it's because your daughter is off to college, or perhaps a stranger is creating cracks in your marriage. Today's story explores a similar scenario. Enjoy. Craig Bryce lay quietly on the bed in his hotel room, fighting to fall asleep. He had just finished making a late-night phone call to Amanda, his wife of over 23 years. He was halfway through another exhausting business trip, and with each passing year, it seemed harder for him to distinguish one trip from the next. The monotony was beginning to blur together, taking a toll on him. He had spent more than half his life on the road, dedicating almost all of his 23 years of marriage to work. Retirement was becoming more appealing by the day. In 6 or 7 years, he hoped he and Mandy would finally be able to enjoy the life they had worked so hard to build together. He wasn't bothered by the job itself, in fact, he loved it. As the vice president of operations, he took pride in the accomplishments of his team, often joking that he didn't do any real work. Instead, he traveled, spoke to people, and aimed to remove obstacles hindering their success. The fact that he was well compensated for this always surprised him. He didn't consider himself smarter or more determined than anyone else, he had simply learned a valuable lesson: more people feared success than failure, a realization rooted in the anxieties of life. His role was to help people overcome that fear. Normally, Craig would drift off easily after his evening chats with Mandy, soothed by the sound of her voice. But lately, that hadn't been the case. A whirlwind of nagging thoughts and suspicions swirled in his mind as he lay there, staring at the ceiling. He had never been a suspicious person, but over the past few months, unease had crept into his heart. He couldn't shake the feeling that Mandy might be cheating on him. Despite his rational mind insisting it was impossible, the small doubts kept accumulating, culminating in a significant event just last week when their daughter, Tori, left for college. Last fall, when Tori left home, Mandy became quiet and withdrawn. Craig attributed it to the empty nest syndrome that often plagues parents when their children move out. Even though he would never admit it, he too felt a profound sadness with Tori gone. When he discussed it with Mandy, she agreed that the absence of their daughter left a massive void in her life. But as the weeks went by, Mandy's sadness deepened. It grew to the point where her boss at Kingston Limited had to sit her down to discuss her declining performance. Then, about 4 months ago, almost as if someone had flipped a switch, Mandy suddenly came alive again. She became cheerful and playful, and her work performance soared. Their intimate life rekindled, too, and Craig teased her good-naturedly about it. She responded with a smile, saying she just wanted to ensure she was taking care of the most important person in her life. They began spending weekends together 2 or 3 times a month, enjoying each other's company like they used to. However, something unsettling began to happen. Mandy started dressing differently, not provocatively, but more professionally. As an office manager for a large national company, appearance was important, but it was another change that sent Craig's anxiety through the roof. She had always been proud of her work and enjoyed discussing it with him, but then she suddenly stopped sharing details about her job. The only thing she mentioned was having to stay late for a new project, but even that felt off. Just a month ago, Craig returned home early from a business trip and decided to drop by her office for lunch. When he arrived, Mandy's assistant, Jennifer, informed him that Mandy had just left with some colleagues. Craig felt an unsettling vibe while he was in the building. Jennifer had become unusually formal in her demeanor, avoiding eye contact and addressing him as Mr. Bryce instead of Craig, as she always had. He almost said something but thought better of it as he walked out. The feeling that several eyes were on him made him check his zipper to ensure it was closed. Was he becoming paranoid in his old age? Later that night, he asked Mandy about her day, and she casually replied that she had so much work to do that she didn't leave her desk. Craig found it curious, especially since he had started noticing other oddities. Mandy had begun changing clothes and showering at strange times, but he convinced himself it was just a coincidence, something she did after long workdays. After all, who wouldn't want to shower after a grueling 12-hour shift? But as he replayed the events in his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The doubts continued to fester as the days passed. Craig felt he was on the edge of something huge but couldn't quite put his finger on it. Was it time to confront Mandy? Or should he dig deeper to find the truth? Either way, the uncertainty gnawed at him, and he knew he had to figure out what was really going on in his marriage. Everything reached a boiling point for Craig that fateful evening. He and Amanda returned home late from work, exhausted and too drained to even think about cooking. They decided to order in instead. As he rummaged through the clutter on the coffee table, he found Amanda's phone closer to him and picked it up to place the order. That's when he discovered it was locked. Seriously? After 20 years, does she really need a password? He asked, raising an eyebrow at her. Amanda laughed nervously, her cheeks flushing slightly. She quickly gave him the code, and he dialed the number to order their food. At the dinner table, she casually explained that her coworkers had insisted she password protect her phone due to the sensitive work data stored on it. Craig nodded, agreeing it was a smart move, but deep down, he brushed it off as something to worry about later. A few nights later, as Amanda slept soundly beside him, so soundly that he could hear her gentle snoring, Craig decided to investigate. She always denied it, insisting that ladies just breathed deeper, but he knew better. With her in a deep slumber, he quietly got out of bed, took her phone, and entered the password she had just given him. To his surprise, he found that she had already changed it. Really, Amanda? He muttered to himself, frustration simmering beneath the surface. In over 20 years of marriage, he had never even considered cheating. Craig prided himself on that loyalty. Early in their relationship, Amanda had been exceptionally jealous whenever he traveled for work, and to ease her worries, he made a habit of calling her every evening. Over time, she had become more relaxed, but Craig maintained a strict personal policy against risky situations. Sometimes he'd have dinner with colleagues, but he always left early. If the group headed to a bar afterward, he would politely decline. His routine was to stop for a quick drink at the nearly empty hotel bar before heading to his room, where he'd order room service, read a book, or catch up on work. After that, he'd call Amanda. He had even shared his habits with her, especially during times when she struggled with his absences, trying to alleviate her anxiety. "Just don't indulge yourself," she'd say teasingly, calling it a dangerous game whenever he returned from his trips. It became a running joke between them. Craig didn't care if others saw him as antisocial or boring. He was not about to put himself in a situation that could stir up Amanda's insecurities. But tonight, as he lay in bed with his hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake off a gnawing doubt. The last few times he called home, it went to voicemail. When he tried her cell phone, he encountered the same fate. Great, he thought, exasperated. He sighed and hung up, refusing to leave a message. It had become a familiar pattern. He received excuses that were starting to wear thin. "Oh, sorry, I fell asleep early. It was too late to call when I woke up." Or, "I was in the basement doing laundry." His least favorite was, "I was late at work and lost track of time." So far, he hadn't yet received the dreaded excuse of, "I went out for drinks with the gang from work." Craig felt terrible for losing trust in her. He knew that a marriage without trust was a precarious place to be. As he lay there, attempting to quiet his racing thoughts, strange noises from the room directly above him caught his attention. "Oh great," he thought. "The hotel isn't even half full, and I have noisy neighbors above me." Such were the hazards of business travel. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and tried unsuccessfully to block out the sound and drift off to sleep. But the unmistakable sounds of passionate lovemaking drifted down to him from the room above. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. This was no intimate act, it was wild and raw. It couldn't possibly be a loving couple. He chuckled bitterly to himself, dozing off only to wake intermittently through the night. Finally, around 4 a.m., he heard the unmistakable sound of a door closing in the hallway, a silence settling in that spoke volumes. He managed to sleep a few hours, and when his alarm went off, Craig groggily rolled out of bed and headed for the bathroom. As he shaved, he could still hear movement from the room above. Someone was going through their morning routine, and he made a mental note to never stay at the hotel again. The walls were far too thin. Curiosity piqued, he decided to venture out into the hallway, perhaps to meet someone in the elevator. Just as he stepped outside his room, he heard the door above him slam shut. A woman emerged, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor as she approached the elevator. When Craig reached the elevator, he hesitated before pressing the button. He heard the elevator pass him, stopping on the floor above. Quickly, he pressed the call button again, and thankfully, the elevator descended immediately, stopping on his floor. As he entered, he noticed only one other person inside. "Good morning," he greeted her. The woman standing there was about his age, but there was nothing particularly remarkable about her. She looked like every other businesswoman he frequently encountered. She was tall, and in her heels, she almost reached his 6-foot frame. Craig estimated her weight to be around 150 well-proportioned pounds. He had always had a preference for curvy women. She was neatly dressed in a traditional business suit, complete with a dark jacket over a white blouse that tastefully showed a reasonable amount of cleavage for a work environment. A simple string of pearls adorned her neck, and her pencil skirt hugged her curves just above the knee, paired with sheer tights. Craig couldn't help but wonder if they were pantyhose or stockings. As the elevator door closed, the air felt charged with unspoken possibilities, and he sensed the unexpected thrill of meeting someone new, something he hadn't anticipated this morning. Craig had a particular preference for stockings with garters, a quirk his wife often indulged. His eyes wandered to the woman sitting across the bar, her dark hair tightly pulled into a bun and dark-framed glasses accentuating her large brown eyes. He had always found women with glasses incredibly attractive and had constantly urged his wife, Mandy, to get her eyes checked in the hope that one day she'd need them. So far, she hadn't, but the thought lingered in the back of his mind. As he descended in the elevator, Craig couldn't help but smile at the striking resemblance the woman bore to Sarah Palin. "Good morning. You look tired," he said cheerfully. With a smile of her own, she replied, "I had a rough night." "I heard. I'm sorry to hear that," he said, feeling a touch of sympathy. "Don't apologize," she replied, laughing lightly. "You saved me $9 on my hotel bill, and it was better than any movie they offered." "I'll try to be quieter tonight," she added playfully. "Please don't. I'd love to save another $9, Craig shot back, chuckling. The elevator reached the lobby, and they stepped out, exchanging warm goodbyes as they headed their separate ways. Craig had a busy day ahead, which quickly pushed thoughts of the intriguing woman from his mind. He threw himself into work, feeling productive and satisfied by the time he returned to the hotel around 6 p.m. As he walked into the lobby, he decided to stop by the bar for his usual scotch before heading to his room. The bar was almost empty, with only the sound of wheeling suitcases rolling across the tile floor breaking the silence. The scene was familiar, business travelers maneuvering oversized bags, attempting to cram them into overhead bins, while Craig, as always, opted to check his luggage. It cost him a few extra minutes, but it kept him calm and provided a front-row seat to the chaos that often ensued on board flights. The bartender seemed engrossed in the local news, which delayed his order. When she finally acknowledged him, he ordered his usual Dewar's White Label on the rocks and settled onto a barstool, preparing for a bit of a wait. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone had called him a pervert earlier, though he shrugged it off. The only other person in the bar was the bartender, who looked more like someone's grandmother than anything else. Turning around, he caught sight of the woman from the elevator again. She was sitting alone in a corner booth, her outfit identical to what she had worn that morning. Craig's heart raced as he approached her, hoping to spark a conversation. As he neared, he noticed the drink in her hand, a glass filled with ice and a couple of fingers of amber liquid. It wasn't wine or some elaborate cocktail, it looked like bourbon. Neat. Interesting choice. "Is this where we exchange business cards?" he asked, grinning as he slid into the booth across from her. "Craig Bryce," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Karina Kine Glenwood," she replied, her handshake firm. "And no, I won't be giving you my business card. You'd probably just use it to start stalking me." They both chuckled, a spark of connection igniting between them, not a romantic one, but rather a shared understanding born from countless nights spent away from home. For a while, they exchanged stories about their jobs and travel schedules, the conversation flowing easily. After what felt like an eternity, Craig's drink finally arrived. He couldn't help but feel disappointed by the bartender's indifference, but he still tipped generously. After all, they were both just trying to make it through another day. As they talked, Craig studied Karina's mannerisms. He noticed how she savored her drink, bringing it to her nose to inhale the scent before taking a sip. She seemed to appreciate the full flavor, not guzzling it down like someone trying to escape their reality. Craig knew he was committing a cardinal sin by filling his scotch glass with ice, but he relished it. He enjoyed the sensation of stirring the drink endlessly with a plastic straw, chewing on one end once the whiskey was gone. The ice was an ally in his little ritual, allowing him to prolong the experience. "Do you travel a lot for work?" he asked, genuinely interested. "Yeah, I do. It's part of the job. But it can get lonely," Karina replied, her eyes thoughtful. Craig nodded, relating to her. "I get that. Sometimes it feels like I'm always living out of a suitcase." "Exactly," she exclaimed. "And all those different hotel rooms start to blend together. It's nice to meet someone who understands." They continued talking, finding comfort in their shared experiences. Craig felt a warmth growing between them, something that might even blossom into a friendship, something genuine amid the transient nature of their lives. As the bar started to fill up with other travelers, Craig and Karina exchanged stories late into the evening. In that dimly lit booth, two souls navigating the complexities of their journeys found solace in each other's company, both knowing that this fleeting moment could very well become a cherished memory in their often lonely lives. Craig absently chewed on a stick, savoring the last bits of flavor while watching Karina sip her drink. As he observed her, a pang of discomfort struck him when he noticed the wedding ring adorning Ken's finger. That simple piece of jewelry stirred up all his insecurities about Amanda. Karina, sensing the shift in his mood, leaned closer. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Craig replied, forcing a smile. "Just had a thought. Do you mind if I ask you something a little personal?" A glimmer sparked in Karina's eyes. "Sure. Good friends can ask personal questions, right? After our little rendezvous last night, I guess that makes us pretty good amigos." They both laughed heartily, drawing a curious glance from the bartender, who turned momentarily from the TV to see what was causing the commotion. After a brief pause, Craig decided to keep the conversation rolling. "So, do you love your husband? And why do you do this?" Karina's mind raced. She took pride in her ability to read people. After all, she was the chief compliance inspector for a large defense company, used to navigating the murky waters of deception. When she first started, people tried to intimidate her, but they quickly learned that she wasn't someone to mess with. Her work ensured compliance with YUC standards, a matter of immense importance for a company whose profits heavily relied on government contracts. Now, most stayed clear of her if they wanted to keep their jobs. As she studied Craig's face, she recognized that he wasn't trying to seduce her or passing moral judgment. His inquiry was rooted in confusion and a sense of sadness. Karina realized he was searching for something deeper, a connection that went beyond casual conversation. "Well, let's start with the easy questions, shall we?" she said, a bit surprised by his candor. When she later discovered that he worked in a similar field, though not with Yuck standards, but in technical compliance, his straightforwardness made more sense. "I do love my husband," she began, thoughtfully. "Do I think we're soulmates destined to be together forever? Not really. We make a great team, and we've raised wonderful kids together." She paused, reflecting. "I hear a lot about people who feel an instant attraction and think they've found their soulmate, but sometimes, it's just pheromones. Love grows over time." Karina pulled out her phone, navigating to the family album. "Here, let me show you." She flipped through pictures of her husband and their 3 teenage kids, her eyes lighting up with pride. It was clear she held deep affection for her family, which only added to Craig's confusion. She put her phone away, her tone shifting slightly. "As for why I do this, it's a bit more complicated. If I promise to tell you everything, can I ask why you want to know?" She suspected she already knew the answer but needed him to articulate it. "I think my wife, Amanda, or Mandy, is cheating on me. The problem is, I know she loves me. At least she did before. So, why?" His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken hurt. Karina felt taken aback, not just by the content but the depth of the conversation they were having. She had intended to head home early in the morning, but it seemed that wouldn't be possible. Craig was a man in pain, and she felt a growing bond with him. "I see," she began slowly, her voice softening. "What I do when I'm away. Sounds cliché, but I feel it makes me a better wife and mother when I get home. I really enjoy being a mom and a wife, but sometimes I feel like that's all I am. I need to feel like my own person, an independent woman in control of my thoughts and body." She paused, contemplating her words. "Don't get me wrong, I know it's wrong and that it might hurt people, but on a cost-benefit basis, it feels worth the risk for the greater good. Do you understand?" Craig nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "But is the potential price worth the risk? If your husband finds out, do you think he'd divorce you?" "That's a really good question," Karina admitted, her gaze drifting. "I would hope not because I don't want to lose my family. But knowing him, yes, I think he would." Her voice trembled slightly, and she looked away to hide the tears that threatened to spill. "I'm very careful about what I do. For instance, I would never sleep with you. Not because you're not attractive, far from it, but because you're married. I won't risk my marriage for someone else's. I can't say I've never been with a married man, some are just so good at hiding it. But I can usually tell." Her gaze was steady as she continued. "A pale ring mark is a dead giveaway. And if you talk to a man long enough, he'll eventually mention his wife, and that's when it's all over for me." Craig nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. "And if they're unmarried and new to this, they tend to brag about it. I can't allow that." Karina leaned back, her demeanor calm. "I also avoid sleeping with men under 35. I travel to a few different places and have a couple of male friends I rely on when needed, but I never cheat on my husband when I'm home. At home, I don't even flirt with men, and I didn't sleep with anyone last night before coming here. I wouldn't do that to my husband." Her confession lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken truths and complex emotions. They shared a moment of understanding, both trapped in their own worlds yet finding solace in the shared struggles of love and fidelity. Craig sat at the bar, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls as he sipped his drink. His mind was racing, but his face remained calm. Karina was seated across from him, her eyes thoughtful, yet troubled. The lounge was nearly empty, just the soft hum of low conversation and the clinking of glasses filling the silence. "Let me ask you something," Craig began, his voice steady. "If your husband, Tom, confronted you, not with photos or a private investigator's report, but just with his suspicions, would you lie to him?" Karina took a deep breath, hesitating for just a moment. The quiet in the lounge allowed her barely audible answer to drift through the space. "No," she whispered. "I wouldn't lie to him. To me, that would be worse than cheating. Am I crazy for thinking that? Craig looked at her seriously, shaking his head. No, Karina. You're not crazy. Complicated, maybe. But not crazy. She let out a small, girlish laugh, though her eyes betrayed deeper thoughts. You know, she said, I never really thought of it that way before. But I guess you're right. It's not simple. Craig leaned forward, his expression softening. Do you ever plan to tell him? Maybe one day, when you're both old, sitting in some nursing home? Karina's gaze turned distant. No, she said quietly. I won't lie to him, but I'll take this secret to the grave. For me, it's about keeping things intact. Craig raised an eyebrow. But doesn't that hurt more? I mean, carrying this around. Isn't that a deeper kind of pain? A worse kind of betrayal? Karina was silent for a moment, the weight of his question lingering between them. Maybe, she finally replied. But my situation is different. I never saw Tom as my soulmate. He's just someone I chose to build a life with, someone I care for. But if I couldn't live the rest of my life with him, it would still hurt. Craig nodded slowly, pondering her words. Do you think he feels the same way? Have you ever asked him why he married you? Again, there was silence. Karina didn't answer, and the quiet stretched on. They both turned their attention to their drinks, the moment hanging heavy between them. Breaking the silence, Craig crunched the last of his ice cubes, the sound oddly loud in the quiet lounge. Karina wrinkled her nose at the noise, feigning disgust, but her eyes betrayed a lingering sadness. I could never cheat on Mandy, Craig said after a pause, his voice more certain now. It's just not in my nature. Karina studied him for a moment before responding. Do you ever think about what you'd say if, in 10 years, your daughter came to you and told you she was thinking about cheating? Would you have any advice for her? The question hit Craig hard, and he took a deep breath, considering it. Honestly? I think about that all the time, he admitted. It's complicated. Karina's eyes grew watery, and she wiped away a tear. Maybe I should stop, she said softly. It's not too late, right? Craig's heart ached for her, but he saw the resignation in her face. You're right, it's not black and white. But, Karina, I don't think you've really made peace with it. You're not explaining it very well to yourself. She smiled weakly. I guess I'm not. But thanks for trying to understand. Craig gave her a soft smile, then shifted the conversation. Do you really think Mandy would cheat on me? Karina straightened up, her demeanor more composed now. First of all, Craig, you don't know for sure if she's cheating. But if she is, I think it's probably for the same reasons I do it. Maybe she just needs something she can't get from you. Craig bristled but remained quiet, his mind racing as Karina continued. Look, this isn't about you. When she's with you, she's a wife and a mother. But maybe with someone else, she can just be herself, without all the responsibilities weighing her down. Craig stared into his glass, swirling the melting ice. If it's not about me, he said quietly, then why am I the one suffering? Karina sighed. The real question is, if she is cheating, can you live with it? Silence fell over them again, but this time it was heavier, more painful. Craig's thoughts drifted back to Mandy, and he wondered what might be going on in her mind. He knew he'd have to confront her eventually, but the idea filled him with dread. Karina stood up, ready to leave. I need to go, Craig. Early flight tomorrow. But thank you for everything. She smiled, though her eyes were sad. Please don't turn up the volume on the TV tonight. I don't want you disturbing my sleep. Craig chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. Good night, Karina. As she walked away, Craig couldn't help but notice how composed she looked, how she carried herself with a grace that belied the storm raging inside her. He knew she was struggling, just as he was. The next day, Craig sat on the plane, staring out of the window as the landscape passed beneath him. His thoughts swirled as they soared over the Rocky Mountains, lost in contemplation. It wasn't until the plane began its descent over Las Vegas that he realized he hadn't even noticed the usual turbulence. Back on the ground, as he drove home from the airport, Craig wrestled with himself. Should he hire a detective to confirm his suspicions about Mandy? Part of him wanted to bury the thoughts and just move on, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. In the end, he decided to confront her directly. He couldn't live with the doubt any longer. The decision had been made. What came next, though, terrified him more than anything else. Craig sat at the kitchen table, staring down at his half-eaten dinner. His mind was buzzing, running through all the signs, all the things he had ignored over the past few months. He couldn't bury his head in the sand anymore. It was time to confront Mandy. Taking a deep breath, he finally spoke, trying to keep his voice calm. "That's the most offensive thing you've ever said to me," Mandy snapped, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. She stood up abruptly, grabbing her plate and marching toward the kitchen. "How could you even ask me that, Craig?" she spat, as if the accusation itself was the betrayal. Craig didn't flinch. He'd expected this reaction, maybe even rehearsed it in his head. "You didn't say no, did you?" he replied evenly, though he could feel the anger boiling just beneath his skin. He was tired of pretending. He had no more doubts. She stopped mid-step but didn't turn around. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, after what felt like forever, she whispered, "You didn't do anything, Craig." "Nothing at all." Mandy still didn't look at him, and that was all the confirmation Craig needed. When she finally did sit back down, her eyes were full of conflict, and he could see the wheels turning in her head. She was deciding, lie, tell the truth, or give some sanitized version of it all. "I can't believe you'd even think that," she began, her voice softening, but Craig could hear the desperation creeping in. "Of course I'm not cheating on you." "Mandy, please," Craig interrupted, his voice firm but weary. "Don't lie to me anymore. Can't we just be adults about this? Are you really going to make me hire a private investigator? Set up cameras? Do all that ridiculous investigative stuff? Why are you making this harder?" Mandy sat there, silent, her eyes darting between the table and him. The tension was unbearable, the truth hovering just out of reach. Then, almost as if she couldn't hold it in any longer, she broke. "Okay, Craig," she sighed. "Yes. I've been seeing someone. For about 4 months now." The air in the room seemed to get sucked out. Craig sat there, stunned, though he'd known it. Hearing it out loud, though, felt like a punch to the gut. All the air knocked out of him. His mind was spinning, struggling to find solid ground. He wanted to scream, to demand more answers, but all he could manage was a quiet, "Why did you lie to me?" Mandy looked down at her hands. "Because, Craig," she whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to blow up our lives. I thought I could just handle it. Make it go away." Craig shook his head, feeling old, tired, and defeated. "I would never lie to you, Mandy. Never. I thought we were soulmates. I thought that meant something." Mandy's eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "You are my soulmate, Craig," she said quietly. "I know it doesn't seem like it now, but it's just complicated. Will you at least let me explain?" Craig felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. "If you feel the need to explain, go ahead. But I've heard it all before, Mandy. The why, the how. None of it really matters to me anymore." Mandy spent the next 20 minutes explaining herself. Craig listened, but only half-heartedly. The words blurred together, excuses blending into reasons, all sounding like hollow echoes. He wasn't even angry anymore, just numb. When she finished, she sat there, waiting for his reaction. "What do you think, Craig?" she asked quietly. Can we go to counseling? Try to fix this. Craig looked up, almost startled. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected to feel so detached, so far removed from the woman sitting across from him. Counseling? He repeated, almost to himself. I don't know, Mandy. I have one more question, though. What is it? She asked, bracing herself. If I never found out. If I hadn't confronted you, would you have ever told me? Maybe when we're 80, sitting on the porch, reflecting on life? Mandy's face crumpled slightly, and he could see she was weighing her answer. Finally, she sighed, defeated. No, Craig. I wouldn't have told you. I wanted to take it to my grave. I didn't want to hurt you. It wasn't about you. It was something I needed. For me. That was the last thing Craig needed to hear. It was done. There was no coming back from this. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized. They sold the house, split everything down the middle, and went their separate ways. It was a clean break, at least legally. Emotionally, though, Craig was still picking up the pieces. A year after the divorce, Craig found himself sitting at yet another nameless hotel bar, his usual drink in front of him. It had become a routine, business trips, quiet bars, and too much time to think. The divorce hadn't been a messy one, but it had still left scars. The biggest blow wasn't emotional, though. It was financial. Instead of retiring at 55 as he planned, he'd have to work until he was 65 to live comfortably. Mandy had moved on. He assumed she was in the same boat, financially speaking, but they didn't talk much. The only silver lining in the whole ordeal was his daughter, Tori. In the wake of the divorce, he and Tori had grown closer. He remembered vividly the first call he'd gotten from her after he'd moved out. Hey, Dad, Tori's voice had been gentle, but firm. Mom told me everything. I'm really sorry about what happened. Craig had braced himself for the inevitable, questions, judgments, maybe even attempts to fix things between him and Mandy. But Tori had surprised him. It's not your fault, honey, Craig had replied. These things just happen. I know, Dad, she'd said. But listen, I need you to hear this. I love you both. You and Mom gave me an amazing childhood, and I'm so grateful. But your relationship is between the two of you. I'm not going to take sides or try to fix anything. I just want you both to be happy. Her voice had trembled slightly, but she pressed on. I'm planning to spend time with both of you. I expect you to behave like adults. Craig had chuckled at that. Don't worry, Tori. We'll manage. Sitting in that hotel bar, Craig took a sip of his drink and smiled to himself. Tori had always been wise beyond her years. And in the end, despite everything that had happened, she was right. Life would go on. It was one of those family events Craig had come to expect. There would always be more in the future, birthdays, holidays, gatherings, but something was different this time. His ex-wife Mandy had approached him, and Tori, their daughter, seemed to be watching the whole thing a little too closely. But what really stood out in his mind wasn't this particular moment, it was a conversation from a long time ago, over 18 months back. A conversation that had stayed with him, haunted him even. Craig remembered Tori's words vividly. Dad, I love you more than life itself, but if you ever speak badly about Mom in front of me, or try to pull me into some drama, it's gonna be a long time before you see me again. Understand? Her tone had been so firm, mature, and yet loving, like she was setting a boundary not just for him, but for herself. Craig hadn't been offended. In fact, he admired her for it. And now, standing there at yet another family function, he could hear her voice echo in his mind. A different voice suddenly broke into his thoughts. Hey, Perv, what a coincidence. How you doin'? It was Karina. Craig snapped back to the present, startled to see her there, looking just as stunning as the first time he'd met her. She had a drink in her hand and a mischievous smile on her face, but her eyes carried a warmth that put him at ease. "Earth to Craig," Karina teased, waving her hand in front of his face. "It's getting a little awkward just standing here while you stare." Craig blinked and stood up quickly. "Oh, sorry, Karina. Please, sit down. I was just lost in my thoughts." After she sat, Karina glanced at his ring finger before looking back at him. "So, she really cheated on you, huh?" There was no joy in her voice, no smugness. She wasn't the kind of person to take pleasure in someone else's pain. Craig sighed, feeling the weight of the unspoken pain he'd been carrying. "You want to talk about it?" she asked, her voice soft but full of understanding. Craig didn't know why, but for the first time since his divorce, he felt like he could. For over 20 minutes, he poured out everything, things he hadn't shared with anyone else. Karina listened without interrupting, just nodding now and then. "So, you still love her, don't you?" Karina asked gently when he finally paused. Craig frowned. "What kind of question is that? I just spent 20 minutes telling you why I divorced her." Karina smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached her eyes. "Yeah, but you never called her a liar or a cheater. You didn't badmouth her at all. It was always Mandy or my wife. That says something." Craig hadn't really considered that before. He hadn't truly let himself think about it. He sat there for a moment, reflecting, before admitting quietly, "Yeah. I guess I still care about her. You can't just stop, you know. Not like that." As he spoke, his eyes drifted to Karina's hand. She wasn't wearing a wedding ring either, and there was no pale line where one used to be. He pointed, "And what about you?" Karina's expression darkened for the first time that night. "I gave myself away," she admitted, her voice thick with regret. Craig leaned forward, concerned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, after we met the first time, I couldn't go back to how things were with Tom," she explained. "I felt guilty, like I was living a lie. I couldn't shake the feeling, and eventually, he noticed. When he asked, I couldn't lie to him." Craig winced, knowing what was coming next. "Yeah. It all came out," she continued. "It was a relief, in a way. But he reacted exactly like I thought he would. He didn't deserve any of it. He's a good guy, just like you. Reminds me of you, actually." Karina took a deep breath before continuing, her words heavy with emotion. "I told you before that he wasn't my soulmate. I thought I was right. But I realized he was, or at least, he was for me. And soulmates don't lie to each other." Craig's voice softened. "So, are you divorced now?" "Not yet," Karina said quietly. "We're legally separated, and we're going to counseling. But it's rough. He's so sad, so distant. I don't think it's going to help. He's moved out, and God, I miss him. He's an amazing father, and it's killing him to be away from the kids." Craig nodded sympathetically. He knew exactly how that felt. "Well, I hope it works out for you," he said, offering her a small, hopeful smile. Karina looked down at her drink and snorted, though Craig couldn't tell if she was laughing or holding back tears. They spent the rest of the evening talking about lighter things, too emotionally drained to dive any deeper. By the time Craig glanced at his watch, it was past midnight. "Wow, sorry for taking up your whole evening," Craig said, feeling a bit guilty. Karina waved it off. "I don't have much else going on these days, Craig. And besides, I'm not exactly out there anymore. I've got one goal now, getting my family back." Her smile returned, though this time it was sadder. "And that means keeping my legs closed for a while." Craig chuckled, shaking his head. "Same here." "Wait, are you rejecting me?" Karina teased. They laughed, but deep down, both knew they were living in the wreckage of their former lives. Over the next few years, they met occasionally, 2 or 3 times a year, sharing their stories, their heartbreaks, and their hopes. In the end, Karina's marriage didn't survive. The damage she'd done to Tom was too great, and though she didn't blame him for leaving, it hurt all the same. Meanwhile, Craig and Mandy remained civil, only interacting when family events made it unavoidable. He noticed the sad smiles she sent his way, but he was determined to move on. Both Craig and Karina were adrift, but they found a strange sort of comfort in their friendship, without benefits, just a bond formed out of mutual respect and understanding. They laughed about how rare it was to find a friend without complications in their lives, and neither wanted to ruin a good thing. And so, they continued on, navigating their separate lives but always knowing they could lean on each other when the loneliness became too much. Craig stood frozen, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes locked on him. He let out a deep sigh, accepting that there was no way out this time. For years, he had skillfully avoided Mandy, evading any chance of running into her. But now, 6 months away from his much-anticipated retirement, he found himself trapped in a situation he had desperately tried to avoid. He had plans to move to the Valley of the Sun, to spend his golden years golfing under the desert sun and sipping drinks on quiet afternoons. The last thing he needed was this, reopening old wounds, facing unresolved emotions. Without even a hint of pleasantries, Mandy broke the silence. "I finally understand why you left me. No, how have you been? No nice weather we're having." She just hit him with it, straight between the eyes. Craig blinked, his mind racing. Was she serious? Could she have really figured it out? After all these years? "It wasn't because I cheated, was it?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with regret. Craig shook his head slowly, a gesture of denial. He hadn't left because of the cheating. It went deeper than that. "It's because I never meant to tell you, isn't it?" Mandy pressed, her voice softer now, more vulnerable. Craig nodded slowly. She had finally said it. He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or angry that it had taken her this long to understand. Mandy let out a hollow laugh, the sound of it thick with years of regret. "Several years of therapy. Someone finally helped me realize just how much damage those words did. I couldn't believe it, Craig. I couldn't believe that I, someone who loved you so deeply, was capable of hurting you like that." Craig stood in silence, letting her words sink in. He could hear the rawness in her voice, and for the first time in years, he wondered if she was truly sorry. "We could have worked through my cheating, Craig," Mandy continued. "I know it. We could have survived that. But when I said those words, I destroyed something between us. Before I said it, I was still trying, still hoping we could make it work. But afterward..." She trailed off, her voice cracking with emotion. "The sad part," she went on, "is that even after I realized what I had done, I was angry at you. Angry that my words had ruined us, even though it was me who had said them. If you could get over the cheating, why couldn't you get over the words? How could something so small, so stupid, be worse than what I did?" Craig felt the familiar pang of bitterness rise within him. He had asked himself those same questions 1,000 times. "Mandy," he said quietly, "the truth is, I never doubted you loved me. Karina, my therapist, helped me see that. It wasn't about your love. It was about trust. You broke my trust, and once that was shattered, there was no going back." Mandy looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. "I still believe I could earn your trust back, Craig. If you gave me a chance." Craig shook his head. "No, Mandy. I don't think you could." Tom, who had been listening silently, suddenly interjected. "You don't understand how deep that trust went, Mandy. Men aren't always the simple creatures we're made out to be. We have emotions, deep emotions. We live with the constant fear of failing the people we care about. I shared a level of intimacy with you that I wouldn't have dared to share with anyone else." Mandy's eyes flashed with confusion. "Craig, you're the strongest man I know." That's the problem, Craig said, his voice hardening. It's an act. A man's inability to show weakness is a survival tactic. It's something ingrained in us. If we show vulnerability, it can cost us everything. Since I was 10 years old, you were the only person I ever cried in front of. Mandy's face softened as she remembered. When your father died. Exactly, Craig said, his voice thickening with emotion. You held me while I grieved. No one else saw me like that. I left myself completely exposed in front of you, and I trusted you to help me through it. But after what happened between us, I knew I'd never be able to be that vulnerable with you again. I was too afraid you'd use that against me. Mandy's breath hitched, but she pressed on. Craig, I never meant to hurt you that way. I know I was selfish, but I loved you. I still love you. And I'm here now, trying to make things right. Can't we start over, even if it's just as friends? Craig closed his eyes, trying to block out the flood of emotions. I've spent years moving past this, Mandy. I'm not sure I want to go back. Mandy took a shaky breath and moved closer to him, resting her hand on his arm. But were you happy? Really happy without me in your life? Craig hesitated, his resolve wavering as he looked into her eyes. What are you asking, Mandy? I'm asking for a chance. Even if we can't be what we once were, can't we still be good together? It doesn't have to be all or nothing, Craig. Please. We don't have to ignore each other at family gatherings for the rest of our lives. Let's start slow, just dinner or a conversation. Anything. Craig's throat tightened, his emotions threatening to break through the years of walls he had built. He wasn't sure if he could let her back in, but as he stood there, watching the woman who had once been everything to him, he realized he wasn't ready to let her go completely either. Craig sat at the table, staring down at his hands, lost in thought. The bustling sounds of a family gathering filled the room, yet here he was, sitting across from Mandy, the mother of his 3 children, feeling more like a stranger than a husband. They were celebrating the birth of their 3rd grandchild, a moment that should have been filled with joy, but the emotional distance between them was impossible to ignore. How did we get here? Mandy's voice was soft, trembling with emotion. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held herself together, determined not to fall apart in front of him. How is it that we've become strangers? We're about to enter this new chapter of our lives, retirement is just around the corner, and we can't even talk to each other. Craig said nothing, though he could feel her words slicing through him. He had always prided himself on being in control, keeping his emotions tightly locked away. But now, seeing Mandy's sadness and the frustration in her eyes, he realized just how far things had spiraled out of his control. Take me to lunch, Craig, Mandy pleaded, her voice growing stronger. Or take me somewhere where no one can see or hear us. Yell at me if you have to, but please, don't keep ignoring me. We're both about to retire, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life alone. Do you? Her words hung in the air, echoing in his mind. Alone. Retirement. Time slipping through their fingers like sand. Craig's thoughts drifted back to a conversation he'd had not long ago with Karina, an old flame from his past. Mandy had no idea, but a few months earlier, Craig had spent several days with Karina and her husband, Tom. It was unexpected, he hadn't seen Karina in years, but she had reached out, and out of curiosity, or maybe nostalgia, he had agreed to meet her. They met in the hotel bar. Craig had been sitting there, nursing a drink, when Karina and Tom walked in, hand in hand. They were both wearing wedding rings, and it had startled Craig at first. In the years since their relationship had ended, Craig had never fully understood why they parted ways. As they sat down, the 3 of them talked about their lives, about the time that had passed, and eventually, they laughed, admitting that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't found anyone better because there wasn't anyone better for them. They hadn't wanted to be alone. Tom had done most of the talking at first, but eventually, Karina and Craig ended up in a deep conversation, something they hadn't done in years. Craig realized then that as you get older, the things that used to matter, the slights, the arguments, the misunderstandings, they don't hold the same weight anymore. What stuck with him most was when Karina had asked him a simple but profound question: what's the worst thing that could happen if we tried again? That question had stopped him in his tracks. What was the worst that could happen? They'd been through heartbreak before, and they had survived it. The thought haunted him because it wasn't just about Karina anymore, it was about his life with Mandy. The years they had spent together, the good times and the bad, and the question of whether it was too late to rebuild what had been broken. "We can't go back to who we were," Karina had said, her voice calm but resolute. "But we can start again, build something new. We sold our house, the things that weighed us down, and now, we travel together. We live for ourselves. We're just us." Craig had admired Karina's clarity, but he wasn't sure he had the same courage. It was one thing to start fresh with someone new, but what about with someone you had already spent decades with? What about the scars and the walls that had been built? Now, sitting across from Mandy, her hand gripping his tighter than it had in years, Craig realized how numb he had become. He had buried his emotions for so long that he wasn't sure how to feel anymore. But something stirred in him as he looked into her eyes, something that had been missing for too long. "Mandy," he started slowly, "you're right. We've wasted too much time. I don't know if I have the strength to fix everything overnight. I don't even know if I can tear down the walls I've built. But maybe we can try." Her eyes softened, the tension in her body loosening ever so slightly. "So, lunch?" she asked, her voice tentative but hopeful. "Or maybe somewhere quiet where you can yell at me." She smiled, a real smile, one he hadn't seen in what felt like forever. Craig chuckled softly, surprising even himself. "Yeah, somewhere quiet. We'll figure it out." For the first time in a long while, Craig felt something other than the cold numbness that had settled over him for years. He didn't know if it would last, if he could rebuild what had been lost, but for the first time, he was willing to step onto that invisible bridge, not knowing if it would hold, but ready to try. At the same time, in another part of the city, Karina Glenwood sat quietly at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden light across the room. It was early spring, the air still cool but fresh. She loved these quiet moments, when the world seemed to slow down and she could reflect on the path her life had taken. Her husband, Tom, shuffled into the kitchen, wearing his usual old robe, stained with years of morning coffee spills. She smiled as she watched him, content with the life they had built together, the second chance they had given each other. Their days were simple, filled with travel and companionship. They weren't trying to recapture what they had once lost, they had created something new, something stronger. As Karina sipped her coffee, she couldn't help but wonder if Craig would ever find the courage to do the same with Mandy. She hoped so. After all, life was too short to spend it alone, locked behind walls of fear and regret. 100 years ago, whenever Karina offered to buy Tom a new coat, he would brush it off with the same response: "Why? There's nothing wrong with this one." That old, worn-out jacket clung to him like a second skin, and despite its fraying edges, he was still wearing it. That familiar, stubborn detail always brought a smile to her face. As Karina sipped her coffee, she found herself tempted to watch Tom wrestle with the new coffee maker. Watching him fumble with it was always a little victory for her, a private bit of comedy. But today, she turned her attention back to her laptop. Her inbox had a new email, one from Craig Bryce, a friend she hadn't heard from in a while. Curious, she clicked on it. The email contained a picture of Craig and his wife Amanda standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. Karina paused, remembering how Craig had mentioned in passing that they would be in Paris for the first day of spring. Seeing the photo made her happy for him. After his divorce, Craig had always seemed so worn down, like he was barely holding it together. He looked exhausted, both physically and emotionally. But here he was, grinning from ear to ear, Amanda by his side, both of them glowing with excitement and joy. "Tom, come look at this," she called out, holding her phone toward him. "It's a picture of Craig and Amanda at the Eiffel Tower." Tom shuffled over, spilling a bit of coffee as he walked, as usual. Karina just shook her head with a playful smile. He leaned in close, squinting at the screen. "Well, would you look at that," Tom said, his tone light. "Craig's a lucky guy." Karina patted Tom gently on the shoulder, her fingers lingering there as she gazed into his familiar pale blue eyes. "Yes," she replied softly, "almost as lucky as I am." But even as she said the words, her mind wandered back to Craig's complicated life. There was more to his story than this happy photo might suggest. Karina remembered the way Craig had struggled after his first marriage fell apart. He had been through hell, and for a long time, it seemed like he would never get his life back on track. Craig's divorce had left him shattered. He had distanced himself from everyone, even his daughter, and for years, he'd walked around like a shadow of his former self. When Craig finally started dating Amanda, Karina was relieved. Amanda had brought him back to life, helped him heal the old wounds that had once made him so cynical and bitter. Their whirlwind romance had been just what Craig needed to break free from the ghosts of his past. Seeing this photo of them in Paris, happier than ever, felt like proof that he had finally found peace. As Karina stared at the photo, something tugged at the back of her mind, something that made her feel uneasy. Craig's life might look perfect now, but the scars of his past were still there, hidden beneath the surface. And Karina couldn't help but wonder, could someone really escape their past so easily? "Tom, what do you think?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Do you think people can really move on from everything?" Tom, never one to dwell on the complexities of life, took a sip of his coffee and shrugged. "I guess so. If they want to." Karina wasn't so sure. As much as she loved seeing Craig happy, she knew that life had a way of bringing things back around, no matter how hard you tried to leave them behind.